I was a master's in public health student at the school. I finished in 2006, and I did my internship with the Population Council in Dakar, working on an evaluation of the Tostan project, which is a human rights-based community education approach to ending female genital cutting, which has expanded from Senegal since then, and it's had a lot of success. So my background is more in maternal health, but this is something that's the Sahel region of Africa is something that is dear to me, and I'm learning a lot more about it. So climatologists have told us that the impact of global warming will not be felt equally around the world. And today I'm going to talk about and turn our attention to the Sahel region of Africa, where it's not so much a question of healthy food in the future, but whether or not there will be food at all to feed the people of that region. I'll talk about food security, climate projections, and its impact on agriculture, as well as some adaptation solutions, and also introduce the OASIS Initiative. Just very briefly, we are organizing to advance solutions in the Sahel, and we do hope to get more and more solutions oriented in the coming years. But we are a relatively new initiative, and I'm afraid that the bulk of this presentation is more in the background than detailed information about solutions. So the Sahel is Arabic for shore. It's a semi-arid zone, ecological zone, that stretches from Senegal in West Africa all the way to Eritrea in East Africa. It's a transitional zone with the Sahara Desert to the north and savannas to the south. This map is a bit out of date. So Sudan actually is included in the ecological zone, not South Sudan. And I want to point out that 7 out of these 10 countries are at the bottom. They're in the bottom 20 of the UN Human Development Index. So 7 out of 10 of these appear in the bottom 20 of a list of 176 countries. And the index measures health, education, and living standards. So generally speaking, it's a poor region with people living with a high burden of disease and low education. And 80% of the people in the region depend on natural resources for their livelihoods and well-being. Water management is key to agriculture, especially in semi-arid regions like the Sahel. But the agriculture in this region is almost entirely rain-fed. And this is a graph showing the rain index in West African Sahelian countries. And what we can see is that between the early 1970s and the mid-1990s, there was one of the most dramatic long-term climate changes observed anywhere in the world in the 20th century. And that rainfall declined on average by more than 20%. The graphs that I have for historic temperature change are very different. They don't project very well, so I didn't include it, but I'm happy to give the reference. And the takeaway message is that by the end of the 21st century, the average seasonal temperatures are expected to exceed the most extreme temperatures from the 20th century. So the big picture is it's getting hotter and drier, and there's abrupt variability in the rainfall. Excuse me. What does this mean for the people in the region? Well, it's drought-prone and famine-stricken, and there's a history of famine. There was $1.9 billion spent on food aid, which seems like a very big number, until we learned that $16 billion was spent in the U.S. alone on marketing junk food, if I understood the presentation this morning. But that $1.9 billion, that's international food aid to the region, that did avert the deaths of about 1 million children. 18 million were food insecure last year, following a bad drought, and 10 million roughly are food insecure this year. Those figures are from Oxfam. So droughts have really gone from being a rare calamity to the new normal, and there have been 3 in the last 10 years. Acute malnutrition rates and child mortality remain persistently high in the region, even in what are considered non-crisis years. I'll just mention that I hope you know that there are some serious inefficiencies and with the U.S. government food aid programs, and they also undermine local agriculture, but that's a talk for another time. This case here, as I said, 1 million deaths were averted, but that number, like 10 million food secure, is very difficult to imagine. So let's look at one acutely malnourished child. Mother Teresa said, "If I look at the masses, I will never act. If I look at the one, I will." And what you see is a band that's measuring, it measures the mid to upper arm circumference, and it makes it easy to make a quick diagnosis about malnutrition. Over the past 10 years, Sahel rates of global acute malnutrition systematically exceeded the WHO's international emergency threshold level of 10%. So stepping back from the Sahel towards developing regions generally, what do we see happening in terms of trends of undernourishment? So the dotted lines, the green dotted line is the World Food Summit target to have, by 2015, the number of people who are undernourished. The red dotted line is the Millennium Development Goal number 1, eradicate extreme poverty and hunger, with the target to have the proportion of people who suffer from hunger. So if you see the non-dotted line, this red line here, if you focus on that, you can feel pretty good that we are making progress toward Millennium Development Goal 1. But we have to also think about absolute numbers of people. And here you can see that the decline is much less significant. In fact, that we're way off target to meet the World Food Summit goal. And in Africa, there are actually more people malnourished today than there were in 1990. And in fact, it's about 50 million more people. One reason for this is population growth, as Malcolm mentioned. And in particular in the Sahel region, it's the fastest population growth in the world. And we see other examples as well from maternal health and maternal mortality, where the proportion may be improving, and the proportion of people suffering from disease may be improving, but the overall number is actually growing, so that the population growth is outpacing development advances. And so what is needed to address this? A lot. I'm going to say a little bit about agriculture adaptation. As you can see from this graph, that Sub-Saharan Africa has a very long way to go to improve crop yields. I put a question mark on this slide last night because I felt that it is overly optimistic to expect to see a green revolution, like many of us are familiar with, occurred in Asia, happening in Africa in the face of climate change. And in fact, I got the opportunity to eat with Alan Weissman, have lunch yesterday with Alan Weissman, who just wrote a book called Countdown. And he gives anecdotal, he was telling a story of meeting scientists at these centers for the Green Revolution. It's the International Maize and Wheat Improvement Center in Texcoco, Mexico, and the International Rice Institute in the Philippines. And he said that the scientists there really are not optimistic that they will be able to have the technological breakthroughs that will allow us to keep our food production in line with population growth. And, So if the challenge is to improve crop yield, to come and approach, for example, the really massive increases we've seen in crop yields in East Asia, how will climate change affect our ability to do this? This is a graph that's actually from a paper by Wolfram Schlenker, who's here at the College of Natural Resources, and looking at what happens to maize yield as temperature rises. And you can see that there is a slight increase as it gets hotter, but 29 degrees, which is about 84 degrees Fahrenheit, there's a really steep decline in the yield. And as you may know, and there are a lot of people who have worked in West Africa, maize is not the principal crop there, but millet and sorghum are. And actually, I've seen papers presented in a different way, but showing that there's really also tremendous effect in heat around this 29 degrees point. Yes.
Are you saying that maize yields are approximately constant between freezing and 28 degrees?
These are increases, aren't they, in about those temperatures? No, they are.
That's a very good question. I actually don't feel comfortable interpreting this part. This is about the days of exposure. So from the paper, they say that there's a decline by 0.7% for each hour, by each 24-hour period exposed to over 29.
It's okay, go ahead.
Sorry, it's a very good question, and it doesn't seem to me that you would grow roughly the same amount at such low temperatures. So the impact in terms of, if we look at climate change, agriculture, and undernourishment, there's predicted to be an impact on productivity by 2030 that's already quite serious. This, again, the crop is maize, and this is from an Oxfam report, but the percent change in productivity relative to a scenario without climate change is serious. It's about 22% in the region, in the Sahel region. So the same climate conditions that are causing, and as they get more extreme and more frequent, will cause crops to wither, are also causing animals to die. Now, it goes without saying that people who have been living in this environment throughout history have a very rich way of handling climate changes. And some of the examples are here. This is from a United Nations Environmental Program report. Some of these are more obvious than others. If you think about the really poor conditions that many people in the region are living in, it's not very obvious how they'll find new paid jobs, but there are, the migration, for example, is quite an important part of their traditional livelihoods. And so these are herders where seasonal migration with their families and their livestock has really been a traditional way of life, but droughts and changes in rainfall have modified the traditional movements. And in particular, the severity of the droughts in the 70s and 80s really stretched the coping mechanisms of people in the region to their limits. So as climate extremes become, as climatologists are calling it, the new normal, a radical shift is needed. And I came across this proverb from Hausa culture that I find very applicable. It's, if the drumbeat changes, the dance must also change. So in the Sahel, with a number of people suffering chronic food insecurity, the drumbeat has changed. Some recommendations in terms of adaptation that are generally agreed upon are development, scaled use of drought-resistant crop varieties, better soil and water conservation, and agroforestry, which many of you know better than I do, but it's about planting trees on farms and restoring soil fertility, which also helps to control erosion, fight against desertification, etc. So I think that this time is not... I'm just going to show this very quickly as an example. This is the Great Green Wall Initiative, which is hugely bold and intends to literally plant a wall of trees across the widest part of Africa, which is 4,400 miles wide. And it's going to be about 9 miles thick wall of trees to fight against desertification and land degradation. But this is a big project in a place where big thinking is needed. I'm sorry, the time here says 25 minutes, but I don't think I've been talking that long.
It's like a 15-minute move quickly.
Okay, I won't say much about resilience, but the thing to know is that really what has been happening in the region, the response from international agencies is not working, and that really we need to go from being reactive to proactive. Or another way to think about it is helping populations living in the region move from a state of vulnerability to resilience. And if we expand the picture of resilience to include, in yellow, high population growth rates and high declines in agriculture production, orange, high population growth rates and low resilience to climate change, and red, countries that are experiencing all three variables. And then we overlay it with these dots. We can see that there are some countries in the region that have a really great opportunity to affect the resilience with actual family planning initiatives. So, in fact, like access to food, a couple's ability to determine how many children they have is also a human right. And I'll say one thing, to paraphrase Norman Borlaug, who's the father of the Green Revolution. He said, there could be no permanent progress in the battle against hunger until the agencies that fight for increased food production and those that fight for slowing population growth unite in a common effort. And very briefly, you can see that family planning in the region is not so much about telling women what to do, it's about giving women what we want, whereas there are about 3 or 4 times as many women who would like to either stop bearing or delay bearing children who are not using modern contraceptives than who are. So what happens if we meet their needs? By lowering fertility in a human rights context, we can actually reduce undernourishment. We can cut by about half the millions of children who are underweight, under 5, with climate change taken into consideration. This is really the impetus for the OASIS Initiative. It shows relative to the mean temperature in the 20th century, what's expected in terms. This is degrees change in Celsius, and on the far right y-axis you can see Fahrenheit. So the climate, the surface air temperature is expected to really increase rapidly throughout the 21st century. At the same time, the population is increasing. It's going to nearly triple by mid this century. So, in closing, our initiative is to help avert humanitarian catastrophe in the region within our children's lifetime. We have a vision where girls are free from early marriage, where women are free to choose timing and number of their children, where everyone has enough to eat. And this relates to the 3 pillars on which we are working. And in conclusion, if you are interested in this, we are trying to get multidisciplinary. We have a multidisciplinary approach. We're trying to find experts from the campus who are interested in it to join our network. This is a time of our next meeting. I'd like to thank the CGPH for inviting me to speak, and thank you to Malcolm for inviting me to join this initiative with him.